President Bush heads to China today for the last leg of his three-nation trip to Asia. The press has been focusing heavily on his decision to visit Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympic Games and criticism of China's human rights record. But there's been hardly any coverage of another story, this one out of South Korea, where the president held summit talks on Wednesday. It was revealed this week that South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is concluding the U.S. military indiscriminately killed large groups of South Korean civilians during the Korean War in the early 1950s. The commission has more than 200 cases on its docket, based on hundreds of citizens' petitions recounting U.S. bombing and strafing runs on South Korean refugee gatherings in 1950 and 51. The citizens' petitions have accumulated since 1999, when the Associated Press confirmed the 1950 refugee killings at No-Gun-ri in 1950, where some 400 civilians, mostly women and children, were killed by U.S. troops. Concluding its first investigations, the Commission is urging the South Korean government to seek U.S. compensation for victims. South Korean legislators have also asked a U.S. Senate committee to join them in investigating declassified evidence that American ground commanders had adopted a policy of deliberately targeting refugees.
Well, what happened in 1999 was actually a contemporary news story as much as a piece of history, because at the time in the 1990s, the survivors of the No-Gun-ri killings, and the survivors estimate that about 400 refugees were killed there, mostly women and children, by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. Those survivors finally were able to bring their stories forth and were demanding an investigation, an apology, compensation, some sort of token of acknowledgement of culpability.
By establishing this memorial, we raise the awareness of ongoing problems of sexual and human trafficking that's taking place in the metro area and the world today. The city of Brookhaven is proud to join a growing list of progressive cities around the world that have installed this memorial to recognize the comfort women and to talk about their suffering.
I find it cosmically ironic that just as the girls and women who were enslaved found it difficult to find their home, this statue had her own challenges. But through the struggle to find a home, we are able to shine a brighter light on the tragedy of the past and those who would deny it. To the young girl and to those who suffered, I say welcome to Brookhaven. Welcome home.
After day shouted to the world that the Chinese communists were agrarian reformers and that our ally, the Republic of China, represented everything that was evil and wicked. Now, my good friends, if there were no communists in our government, would we have consented to and connived to turn over all of our Chinese friends to the Russians? Now, my good friends, if there had been no communists in our government, would we have rewarded them with all of Manchuria, half of the Kuril Islands, and one half of Korea? Now, how many Americans have died and will die because of this sellout to communist Russia? God only knows. If there were no communists in our government, why did we delay for 18 months? Delay our research on the hydrogen bomb, even though our intelligence agencies were reporting day after day that the Russians were feverishly pushing their development of the H-bomb. And may I say to America tonight that our nation may well die. Our nation may well die because of that 18 months deliberate delay. And I ask you, who caused it? Was it loyal Americans, or was it traitors in our government?
When Mao Zedong came to power, he couldn't have come to power had it not been for very powerful forces inside the United States. At the end of World War II, the Japanese had been driven out, but there was a large division in China. The nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek held a large portion of the country, and another section was in the hands of the communist forces, Chinese forces, under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And the nationalist forces and the communist forces were bitter enemies, even though they had fought more or less together against the Japanese. They both knew that when the war was over, only one or the other would be able to survive. And so they were preparing to fight each other. That was not in the best interests of the people in Washington, D.C. They didn't want that to happen, and they put pressure on the nationalist Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek's government, to accept the communists into their own government in key positions, what they call a coalition government. And they wanted them to go into very key positions. In other words, in control of the military in particular. Well, that's the end of the game, you know. The nationalists didn't want any part of that. So General George Catlett Marshall, who was in charge of all of the military operations in the Asia theater at that time, simply cut off the flow of ammunition and arms to the nationalist Chinese and made sure that all of the military equipment that was left behind by the Japanese was delivered to the communist Chinese. And with those two acts, there was no question that Mao Zedong's forces, which was now by this time much better equipped than the nationalist forces, that they would be victorious, and that is how it came to be. And George Marshall even boasted afterwards. He said, "With the stroke of my pen, I now disarm 30 divisions of Chiang Kai-shek's army." So that all came out of the United States. That was the decision of the so-called capitalist forces in America, that the Chinese communists would now take over China. So all of these things are contrary to the conventional knowledge of what happened in history, but as I said before, none of it is really difficult to find. It's a matter of recordable, it has been recorded history, and it's not even a question of opinion anymore.
This is the Alger Hiss Defense Fund, the notorious Soviet spy. I know that Hiss denied the charges, but now the recently released FBI's VENONA tapes have shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was in fact a Soviet agent. Those self-respecting anti-communists would have a defense fund for a communist spy. So you might think, well, maybe he wasn't such an anti-communist, but I bet he was a patriot. I bet he went skipping down the street singing Yankee Doodle Dandy. Not quite. When he left the State Department, David Rockefeller appointed him editor of Foreign Affairs, this nation's #1 journal, calling for an end to American sovereignty. One more thing about Vietnam, though. What caused President Johnson to escalate the war? Why did he suddenly start sending hundreds of thousands of troops in 1965? The reason is he had a secret meeting with a secret clique of advisors called the Wise Men, 14 senior policy advisors, 12 of whom were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Mr. Perloff, I think we just heard some more conspiracy gobbledygook. I don't believe there was any such meeting. If you don't believe it, you need to read the book, The Wise Men, by Isaacson and Thomas, members of the CFR. And this book is, by the way, not condemning them. It's glorifying them. Who was the leader of the Wise Men? It was Dean Acheson. It was Acheson who was most vocal in insisting to Johnson that he must escalate the war in Vietnam. So you'll think, well, Jim, obviously then, he must have been motivated by anti-communism. To the contrary. You know what he was doing back in the 1920s? Joseph Stalin, this is before we even recognized the Bolshevik regime. Joseph Stalin picked a young New York attorney to represent Bolshevik interests in America. He picked Dean Acheson. Now, some people would say, well, Jim, I'm sure there's an easy explanation for that. You know, probably Stalin didn't know who to get for an attorney, so he just flipped over the Manhattan Yellow Pages, and he closed his eyes, and he put his finger down, and it just happened to come down on Dean Acheson's name. After World War II, the communist regime, the new communist regime in Poland was having trouble getting U.S. recognition. Whose law firm did they recruit to get U.S. recognition? The law firm that every communist knew he could trust, the law firm of Dean Acheson. Acheson's law partner was Donald Hiss, the brother of the Soviet spy. When Acheson was in the State Department, he surrounded himself with 14 members of the U.S. Communist Party. That's not imagination, that is a fact. John Stuart Service, John Carter Vincent, Lachlan Curry. When John Stuart Service was caught passing secrets to the Soviet Union by the FBI, Acheson didn't fire him, he promoted him.
Acheson recast his Asia policy in late 1949. Policy on China seemed to be clear. The United States of America is not going to quibble about the integrity of its position. As the President has stated, we are not going to use our forces in connection with the present situation in Formosa. We are not going to attempt to seize the island. We are not going to get involved militarily in any way on the island of Formosa.
But policy on Korea was not settled. In January 1950, Acheson outlined a two-tier strategic approach at the press club.
Dean Acheson's press club speech was very important, not so much for what it exactly said, but how it was interpreted. Well, he described our defense perimeter in the Pacific, and he left Korea out of that perimeter. He did add that for areas beyond this line, resort must be had to the United Nations, and the experience has been that that is not a weak reed upon which to lean. But nevertheless, his speech was widely interpreted as writing off Korea.
This Acheson speech was exactly like Hitler's contention that he wanted peace. It was all deception, and the leadership in North Korea was fully aware of this. The South Korean army couldn't mobilize without the permission of the USA, and was entirely dependent on them for ammunition and fuel.
North Korea was now well supplied with Soviet T-34 tanks. It had a well-trained army, augmented by 60,000 veterans who had fought in the Chinese Civil War. In February 1950, Kim Il-sung's giant neighbors, China and Russia, signed their own treaty in Moscow. The communists feared a revived Japan. To the west, it looked a menacing coalition. In reality, Stalin had forced the treaty on an angry but aloof Mao. Mao's first need was to rebuild China. The anti-communists were also clustering together. MacArthur began to take more interest in Korea. Rhee became a welcome visitor to Tokyo. Washington threatened to cut vital aid unless he reformed. Starting with an artillery barrage on the Ongjin Peninsula in the west, fighting broke out sometime in the early morning of June the 25th. News of the fighting reached Washington on a Saturday evening.
I myself, who was Assistant Secretary for Far Eastern Affairs, was having dinner with the columnist Joseph Alsop, and at that same dinner was Secretary of the Army Frank Pace. And no one had called us to say the North Koreans are about to attack.
An officer came in and conferred with Dean Rusk and myself, advised of what had happened. Both Secretary Acheson and Secretary Johnson were out of the city, and so I went to the Pentagon and Dean went to the State Department, and I stayed there all night.
Acheson raced back to Washington, told Truman there was no need for him to hurry back, and took charge.
At that meeting, the first issue is, do we respond? And I think that was not a difficult proposition. I think it was clearly identified in the minds of almost all of the participants that if we allowed this particular action to move unchallenged, that we faced long-range trouble, particularly with the Soviet Union.
The Russians had been boycotting the Security Council because of its refusal to seat Communist China. They failed to return.
I was amazed that the Russians, when they realized what the Security Council was about to do, did not suddenly appear and do something about it. Because if it were true that the Russians were well aware of what was about to happen, it's most unlikely that they would have stayed away from the Security Council that afternoon. I think the Russians were a bit surprised by what happened and didn't get themselves organized in time.
And to this day, I still don't understand it. And resent. And consider it a stupid error on our part. We should not have allowed the Security Council which was wholly pro the USA, to pass a resolution to send troops to Korea under the blue flag of the United Nations.
О том, чтобы послать в Корею войска под голубым флагом ООН.
At midnight yesterday, I was informed that the conflict appeared to have broken out in Korea.
The breakdown here is a fact that is even in mainline history books, but is not taught on the History Channel or on the nightly news in general. Sometimes the History Channel has actually gotten it right and told the truth. And that's where we start. 1949. The communists had been around since the 30s. They'd taken over some of the mountainous areas in China. They had held out during World War II. And at the end of World War II, they became allied with the then brand new CIA that had come out of the British OSS. And basically, even a lot of U.S. intelligence officers and Army officers got arrested by the communists because they wouldn't go along with the full takeover of the country, and they themselves were tortured, they were killed. Many of the Christian missionaries that were there were also captured and killed. And of course, the John Birch Society is named after John Birch, who was captured and tortured to death for not supporting the communists. And our government completely turned a blind eye to all of this. Now, it's a huge history. I'm going to stop there with what happened in 1949. But if we fast forward to 1979, by then deals have been made behind the scenes via Henry Kissinger and George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then ambassador to China. Of course, he'd also been director of the CIA, to make a deal economically with China to give them the rare earth minerals, to give them the Panama Canal, and to give them control of resources as long as they didn't become military dominant in the surrounding areas of Asia, like the South China Sea, and as long as they didn't menace Japan. This is all mainline history, folks. Now, of course, from the beginning, China was double dealing the entire time. Now, fast forward to 2016, China has 97.5% of rare earth minerals that you need to make basically any computer device or electronics. That's been done by design. The West just doesn't touch it, doesn't mine it, doesn't go after it, because there's a corporate global treaty, just like TPP, unratified by governments but followed, okay? So fast forward to the globalist operative who was following this whole plan of Kissinger and Brzezinski, 1979, who's president? You guessed it, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter signs a deal to hand over the Panama Canal, the eighth wonder of the world, to the communist Chinese. He then signs a deal to give them all the major deep water ports that the U.S. had previously had in the world, and to give them access to all of our refueling stations, previously known as coaling stations. Again, the globalists are making a deal to use Chinese slave labor to leverage out the planet's other major economic and industrial operations to create an economic consolidation, vertical integration model. This is globalism. China is the key. That's why they say China is the new century. America and the West is declining. China's the future, because the deal was made because they were authoritarian, to transfer all power to them, because they would then side with the globalists in the phase we're now entering to establish an open world corporate government.
The whole idea was to give the next generation the information that we now have about how the Soviet Union operated its intelligence service against us when we were ostensibly allies during World War II. And it was an incredible thing. The Soviets had something that no other government at any time in history ever had, and that is a cadre of people in the other country who were loyal to the Soviet Union, and because they were loyal, they were prepared to spy against their own country. That's an amazing concept. Usually, you can get a spy here, or you get a spy there. Sometimes you get a spy for ideology, sometimes you get them for money. But the Soviets got a large number of people on the basis of ideology. Some of these people paid dues to the Communist Party for the privilege of being spies for the Soviet Union. And they were in the most incredible places. I mean, we all know the names of Alger Hiss in the State Department or Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department. But there were many more. There was Lachlan Curry in the White House, and amazingly, President Roosevelt's closest friend and associate, Harry Hopkins, in the White House. A man who knew everything about everything in the United States government, anything he wanted to know. And his control officer, and we talk about him in the book and the control officer as well, Isaac Akhmerov, who was one of the most amazing men in the history of Soviet intelligence. He was here as an illegal. To the Americans, the American government, he was just a man with an accent who happened to be a businessman in New York and in Baltimore with an American wife. Very nice gentleman. Everybody liked him. He was the illegal directorate for the Soviet intelligence service, at that time called NKVD. We later knew it as KGB. He was the illegal director in the United States. And he handled Harry Hopkins. He met with Alger Hiss. He met with a number of other of the key spies. And we knew about him. We only knew a name. We only knew him as Bill. When Elizabeth Bentley in 1945 told the FBI about her role in Soviet spying, and she said, my contact was a Russian who I only know as Bill. It took years for the FBI to identify that Bill as Isaac Akhmerov. And in the 1970s, Akhmerov, teaching at the KGB school in Moscow, boasted to his class that he ran Harry Hopkins, the most important American agent that the Soviet Union had. And sitting in that class was Oleg Gordievsky, who defected to the British and spent 10 years in KGB on behalf of the British intelligence service, reporting what the KGB was into. And Gordievsky is an incredibly courageous man who was able to report to the West about what was happening. But the interesting thing in this context is he heard Akhmerov talk about Akhmerov's agent, Harry Hopkins. You look at the role of some of these people in very high positions. Why did they spy? They spied because their loyalty was to the Soviet Union. In regard to Alger Hiss, who Novatsky defended for so many years, the document is quite clear. Akhmerov meets with Hiss, who was not an agent of the NKVD. He was an agent of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. And he contacted Akhmerov to say that his handlers, his military handlers, were not treating his information with the respect he expected, and they were paying no attention to important material he had, and could the NKVD take over the transmission of some of this material back to Moscow. And he boasts to Akhmerov that when he was in Moscow after the Yalta conference, he was in the American delegation at Yalta and an advisor to President Roosevelt. He then flew with the Secretary of State to Moscow, and at obviously not in the presence of any other American, the Soviet government gave him a medal for his work against the United States. And so Novatsky would like to defend these people still, but it's embarrassing to him that there are people going into the archives and looking at the materials and actually understanding what these materials mean. The fact that for a long time, Americans were taught that the Soviet Union was our ally in World War II, and if we had differences later, we should never forget that they were our ally. What the VENONA documents teach us is that we were co-belligerents, but we were not allies. They were spying in the United States not only against our government, but against ordinary Americans who were doing things that the Soviets were concerned about. And let me talk about one aspect of that. The Soviet intelligence service sent their agents into Jewish organizations because those groups were trying to help the Jews in the Nazi-occupied areas of Europe, were trying to get opportunities to smuggle them out. We all know about Wallenberg, who used money that was sent by the War Refugee Board to pay off Nazi officials so that he could smuggle Jews out of their grasp. That's what the Russians wanted to know about. They wanted to know who was helping the United States and who was helping American Jewish organizations provide support for the people who were the victims of Nazism. Why did they care about this? Because the Soviet Union intended to and succeeded in taking control of Central and Eastern Europe. And those people, those who were saved, were people who would be supporters of democracy. And that was their enemy for the future. And so the Soviet intelligence network needed to know who those people are in Eastern Europe who are helping to smuggle out Jews. Who are those people in Eastern Europe who are connected with the Americans so that they can be persecuted after the war? This is an incredible thing. And we see it now in part from the VENONA materials because it identifies the people who went in to spy to help the Soviet Union, not to help the United States. And the more we see of this material, and I hope we're going to be seeing a lot more of it in the future, it teaches us that we have to be alert to the fact that a totalitarian regime, whether it's Nazi or communist, can never really be our allies. They are always our enemies because we believe in freedom and they don't.
Harry Dexter White was asked to implement what the Soviets called Operation Snow. Operation Snow was a code name for starting a war between the United States and Japan by deceptive means. Each side had to feel threatened by the other so that they would fight and they would leave the Soviets free in Asia. He writes a memo that threatens Japanese sovereignty and is insulting at the same time and makes it seem as if the United States were about to attack Japan. When the Japanese Emperor Hirohito and his cabinet received the memo, they said that the Americans meant war. They knew they had no chance against America, so they decided to strike first and hope for a negotiated peace. November 26th, the Japanese launched their fleet toward Pearl Harbor, and on December 7th, the attack took place.
December 7th, 1941.
More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives at Pearl Harbor, and thousands of others died in the first few weeks of the war. White was able to start a war between the Japanese and the United States that neither country wanted, that the United States wasn't ready for, and that the Japanese knew they couldn't possibly win. In 1940s, the Finns in Finland picked up a Soviet code book. They sold it to the United States for $15,000. These are called the VENONA decrypts, and they were field memos from Soviet spies in the United States to Moscow. They discovered that a man named Jurist was described as providing a large amount of valuable information and that he was a close friend of Morgenthau. By following their itinerary, they found that the man, Jurist, who was traveling with Morgenthau was Harry Dexter White.
It's a Pearl Harbor anniversary story you probably won't see anywhere else. The intriguing possibility that in launching a sneak attack, Japan did to us what we might well have done to them. Tonight you'll hear the details of a secret plan approved at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
With the approach of the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, America has been getting a refresher course on the attack. We're reminded that in the fall of 1941, relations between the U.S. and Japan had steadily deteriorated. But untold is that the United States itself was plotting a secret effort against the Japanese. And now, as Stone Phillips shows us, the old story has a new chapter.
It was Sunday afternoon in New York, and many Americans were cozied up to the radio, listening to an exciting football game.
He's up to the 25, and now he's hit and hit hard about the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tackle. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
It was news that stunned the nation.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Now, when most Americans think of Pearl Harbor, they remember how badly the U.S. was blindsided by Japan's naked and unprovoked aggression. How we were literally caught dead in the water, virtual sitting ducks. But what most Americans don't know, and what President Roosevelt never disclosed, is that America had its own secret plan to bomb Japan first. This plan, signed and approved by FDR himself on July 23, 1941, nearly 5 months before Pearl Harbor.
No one knew about the bombing plans.
That was secret. All the supplies were secret. I mean, what we were sending was not a matter of public knowledge.
Our story begins with a romantic chapter out of military lore, well known to the American public. It is the story of the Flying Tigers and their famous shark-toothed P-40s. Also known as the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, they were a small group of daring U.S. flyers, led by this fighter ace named Claire Chennault. They were known as mercenaries, hired by China before Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese were the bad guys, no question about it.
And your mission was to take them on?
Yes, yes.
Their primary objective was to protect China's only lifeline, this winding supply route known as the Burma Road.
Certainly, order of priority was, one, seize control of the air over China. Keep China in the war.
Skip Adair's job was to find the volunteer pilots.
When you were recruiting men for the American Volunteer Group that summer, 1941, what was the strategic goal of the operation?
We were to kill as many damn Japanese as we could. That's simple.
But in reality, the pilots Adair recruited were not mercenaries at all. While they flew under the Chinese flag, their operation was planned and paid for by the U.S. government.
The U.S. government knew about this, helped develop this plan.
Not only knew about it, but they were 100% behind it. Where do you think the $50 million came from? The United States. It was secret. Nobody was supposed to talk about it. We did a damn good job of keeping it secret.
And the need for secrecy wasn't just for military reasons. Sending not just equipment, but soldiers to China would have been a violation of U.S. neutrality laws.
It was against the U.S. law to fight for under another flag for another country.
But what most Americans will be startled to hear, and what is the subject of this report, is that the United States, long before Pearl Harbor, had secret plans for a second American volunteer group with a much more daring mission.
There was a second group, which would be a bomber group, and the third group would be another fighter group.
So it was all in the works.
Yes,
at least that was what you were being told.
Yes.
We knew that there's going to be a bomber group formed. In fact, Chennault told me that I would probably get the bomber group.
A secret bomber group flying against Japan before Pearl Harbor? Sounds inconceivable. But Claire Chennault, the leader of the Flying Tigers, laid out his offensive strategy for Japan early on. Quote, if the men and equipment were of good quality, such a force could cripple the Japanese war effort. A small number of long-range bombers carrying incendiary bombs could quickly reduce Japan's paper and matchwood cities to heaps of smoking ashes. Now, those were Chennault's words. The question is whether his plan was backed up by the White House. That's the crucial question we wanted someone to answer.
But after half a century, we thought that might be impossible. Well, surprisingly, there is one key figure from FDR's White House who is still around to answer our questions.
His name is Lachlan Curry. In 1941, he was one of the president's closest advisors, Roosevelt's personal envoy to China, and Claire Chennault's biggest supporter in the White House. Today, Curry lives in South America. He is 89 years old, and his voice is frail.
Claire Chennault wanted to bomb Japan, didn't he?
Yes, very much so.
You were an enthusiastic supporter of Chennault's plan.
Oh, yes. And I helped in every way I could, yes.
To push the plan through, to see that it was executed.
The whole project, yes.
This was the secret plan, as presented to President Roosevelt, called JB 355, JB standing for Joint Board, which is the equivalent of today's Joint Chiefs of Staff. Discreetly labeled Aircraft Requirements of the Chinese Government, it lists among the strategical objectives destruction of Japanese factories in order to cripple production of munitions and essential articles for maintenance of economic structure in Japan. The distances from Chinese air bases to target cities in Japan are clearly mapped out. Nagasaki, 730 miles from Chuchao. Osaka, 1,060 miles from Manchao. Tokyo, 1,780 miles from Hangzhou. Was it workable? Were planes available that could do the job? An entry written by renowned General Hap Arnold says, the Lockheed Hudsons have ample range to perform missions against targets in Japan. Advanced bases are available in eastern China. It is 1,300 miles from these advanced bases to industrial Japan. The plan was signed off by the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and approved by FDR. The date, July 23, 1941, almost 5 months before Pearl Harbor.
You worked to make sure the bombers were in the pipeline, to see to it that this happened.
That was my job, yes.
And the pilots?
And the pilots, yes.
On July 22nd, 1941, you sent a secret cable to Chenault. I am very happy to be able to report that today, the President directed that 66 bombers be made available to China this year, with 24 to be delivered immediately. Why would you be procuring bombers?
Well, actually, the purpose of bombers is to bomb. We can't pretend that we didn't know what the bombers were for.
And according to this plan, they were going to be manned by Americans.
Volunteer Americans were paid. They were mercenaries.
But the White House was very much in favor of it. So this had the blessing of the U.S. government.
It had the blessing of it.
Do you think FDR was trying to provoke the Japanese?
I have a firm conviction that he was. These words were from Bullitt's own lips. He said, the president asked me, by the way, Bill, how are you going out to India or China? And he said, well, I'd planned to take Pan Am across the Pacific, Mr. President. And he said, President Roosevelt looked at me and said, Bill, if I were you, I'd go the other way, through the Middle East. I think there's going to be a war out there, and you just might not make it.
Hamilton Fish was a prominent Republican politician of the same generation as President Roosevelt. In his book, FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, How We Were Tricked into World War II, Fish undertakes a critical examination of how Roosevelt was determined to involve the United States of America into war and his responsibility for deceiving Congress to make World War II. Let us consider the following excerpt from Fish's book. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe sought peace through negotiation with America. However, President Roosevelt continually rejected Konoe's request for a meeting between the two leaders. The United States presented Japan with an ultimatum in the form of the Hull Note, in an attempt to goad Japan into war. By doing so, the United States of America would then be able to declare war on Germany. Fish also states the following. There was strong opposition from within America regarding entry into a European war. Accordingly, in order to declare war, the Roosevelt administration needed America to be attacked by another country. Therefore, the government allowed Pearl Harbor to be attacked, thus gaining overwhelming public support for entering into war. In addition to the Hull Note being an ultimatum towards Japan, the very existence of the note was hidden after the start of the war. This led to the American public believing that Japan had launched a surprise attack in the midst of peace negotiations. According to the government's plan, this created passionate support for Roosevelt's call for war. Japan fought courageously to the bitter end. There must never be another war between the United States and Japan. There is nothing revisionary about an attempt to fairly examine the history of a nation and its people. I seek nothing more than to wipe away the one-sided post-war bias and conduct a fair examination of the past, recognizing what is truly right and wrong. This is the proper stance to be taken by an independent nation. Furthermore, such a fair examination of history will enable foreign diplomacy on equal terms.
90% wanted to keep out of war, and 10% were ready to go into war. That's in the president's own district, and that was a real live poll. So I knew I was right, but he had it all fixed the other way. And he got us in this war by tricking them, having a communist write the war declaration written by a communist in the Treasury Department, acting as head of the Treasury Department in Morgenthau's absence, or with Morgenthau's cooperation, and that's how we got into war.
Japan had successfully modernized Taiwan's education, economy, and infrastructure. Tainan and the character of its people had been remade over the 50-year occupation. Japan left its imprint on every aspect of Tainan life. It had become one of Asia's most global cities, but the city was still in search of an identity it could call its own. This is National Cheng Kung University, one of Taiwan's top schools and a model of Japanese architecture. Buildings erected by the Japanese dot the landscape of Tainan. They are recognizable by their Western design elements, including Baroque arches and columns. The Japanese developed Tainan to meet the needs of a modern economy. But they didn't ignore aesthetic considerations. Along the boulevards, they planted phoenix trees. Today, the phoenix is the city's official tree and represents its regenerative strength. Memories of Japanese occupation are still vivid for those who lived through them. Some are still bitter, but many are grateful for the contributions made by the Japanese. The debate continues on the legacy of the Japanese. It's hard to deny the many contributions they made to Tainan. After 50 years of colonization, Tainan was transformed into a model city. It had an advanced economy, infrastructure, and sophisticated agricultural methods. The city now faced the pressures of modernization and the opportunity to chart its own path. Huang Tianheng grew up during the Japanese occupation, when members of his family were high officials. After more than a century, he is still nostalgic.
Thought that we leave Siam and continue our voyage to Korea, where this same Buddhism is supported by another 17 million souls. We arrive at the port of Seoul, the chief city, where the unofficial reception committee is composed of a rather curious gathering, all as anxious to see us as we are to see them. The white-robed gentleman with the funny hat is the main attraction. This fellow is a typical example of the native Korean. He bows to the dominion of Japan, but he firmly declines to admit the superiority of Japan's intellectual and moral culture over his own. Japanese Empire. Here in the new palace, amid the regal splendor of a departed era, the former king of Korea lives on the bounty of his Japanese masters. The streets of Seoul illustrates how thoroughly the Japanese are assimilating Korea. Somehow the women of Seoul seem to be the dominating sex, and we wonder if this dates back to a certain custom that was once rigidly enforced. Every evening at exactly 9 o'clock, a curfew bell was rung as a warning for all men to hurry home and remain indoors so that the women could enjoy the freedom of the streets. This law, however, has been abandoned, perhaps at the request of the ladies themselves. The children of Korea are particularly interesting. Almost from the time they are able to walk, they are obliged to care for their little brothers and sisters. The first thing inculcated in a Korean child's mind is respect for his father. In fact, the four dreadful things which a boy fears most are earthquake, wind, fire, and father. Playing dinner and imitating the ponderous etiquette of their elders is a favorite amusement. This little tot was most reluctant about permitting us to photograph the baby on her back. In an oriental garden, we were afforded the special privilege of seeing a native dance, very much like those given by the geisha girls of Japan. This is called the drum dance. Whatever else we may have seen in Korea, we will never forget the gentlemen with the white robes and the horsehair hats, for they are Korea personified. And it is here that old Korea bows to us in gracious farewell.
If there were no communists in our government, why did we delay for 18 months, delay our research on the hydrogen bomb, even though our intelligence agencies were reporting day after day that the Russians were feverishly pushing their development of the H-bomb? And may I say to America tonight that our nation may well die, our nation may well die because of that 18 months deliberate delay. And I ask you, who caused it? Was it loyal Americans or was it traitors in our government?
South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a 2-year-old investigative body, is looking into the U.S. military's links to mass political executions carried out by the South Korean government early in the Korean War. The commission believes that in mid-1950, at least 100,000 South Korean detainees were shot to death by their own military and civil police and dumped into mass graves, usually without charge or trial. The political prisoners included South Korean leftists, but also hapless peasants caught up in anti-communist sweeps. The right-wing government, a U.S. ally, had them killed to keep them from being freed by the communist North Korean invasion force. In documents from 1950, Korean investigators will find an ambivalent U.S. attitude toward the secretive mass killings. At times, U.S. diplomats expressed disapproval to Korean officials. At other times, the Americans took a hands-off approach, and at least once they went beyond that. That was when, according to one document, a senior U.S. military advisor, an Army colonel, gave conditional approval to a South Korean colonel's plan to execute 3,500 political prisoners in the southern city of Busan. The American colonel first tried to discourage it, but he then told the Korean it would be permitted to machine gun the prisoners if North Korean troops closed in on Busan city. Eventually, hundreds of prisoners were taken out and killed in the Busan area. Later in 1950, a U.S. diplomat reported confidentially that overall U.S. Commander General Douglas MacArthur wouldn't interfere with the mass killings, even though they were being carried out by South Korean forces under his ultimate command. The question arises, how could such large-scale executions have remained hidden from history for a half-century? Historian Kim Dong-chun, a member of the Korean Commission, was asked that question.
It is related to how Korean War ended. The Cold War regime in South Korea was consolidated after the Korean War, and harsh dictatorship ruled after the Korean War, and even the victims' family members couldn't speak out the life history of their families. Korean military government branded the victims of massacres as communist.
Genocide more than a decade ago, to killings in another part of the world, to killings in Korea.
President Bush heads to China today for the last leg of his three-nation trip to Asia. The press has been focusing heavily on his decision to visit Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympic Games and criticism of China's human rights record. But there's been hardly any coverage of another story, this one out of South Korea, where the president held summit talks on Wednesday. It was revealed this week that South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is concluding the U.S. military indiscriminately killed large groups of South Korean civilians during the Korean War in the early 1950s. The commission has more than 200 cases on its docket, based on hundreds of citizens' petitions recounting U.S. bombing and strafing runs on South Korean refugee gatherings in 1950 and 51. The citizens' petitions have accumulated since 1999, when the Associated Press confirmed the 1950 refugee killings at Nogan-ri in 1950, where some 400 civilians, mostly women and children, were killed by U.S. troops. Concluding its first investigations, the Commission is urging the South Korean government to seek U.S. compensation for victims. South Korean legislators have also asked a U.S. Senate committee to join them in investigating declassified evidence that American ground commanders had adopted a policy of deliberately targeting refugees.
Well,
What happened in 1999 was actually a contemporary news story as much as a piece of history, because at the time in the 1990s, the survivors of the Nogan-Ri killings, and the survivors estimate that about 400 refugees were killed there, mostly women and children, by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. Those survivors finally were able to bring their stories forth and were demanding an investigation, an apology, compensation, some sort of token of acknowledgement of culpability. What happened was, after the division of Korea in 1945 by the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the effort to unite the two Koreas failed, and in June of 1950, the North Koreans invaded, the communist North Koreans invaded South Korea. This sent large numbers of South Korean refugees moving farther and farther south as the North Koreans advanced. And the United States very hastily decided to intervene with troops who were really unprepared for what they were about to face. And one thing led to another, rumors and fears and panic among the U.S. troops, such that they became convinced that every Korean was their enemy, in effect, many of the troops and many of the commanders. And so at this place called Nogan-Ri, which is a tiny village in central South Korea, the people from two nearby villages had been chased by U.S. troops to head farther south, and they ran into a battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. First, what happened to these people was that they were strafed and bombed by U.S. airplanes, warplanes, and secondly, then they were trapped and fired upon for 3 days, trapped around and under a railroad bridge, and the survivors, as I say, estimate that 400 of them were killed. At the time, we discovered in our research that there were documented orders to fire on refugees. In fact, the most important document that has emerged was discovered by the American historian Sarah Conway Lands and disclosed only recently. It was a letter from the U.S. ambassador in South Korea at the time, John Muccio, writing back to the State Department in Washington, saying that the U.S. Army has adopted a policy of firing on refugees that approach their lines despite warning shots and such. And so this was, in essence, clearly a policy that was countenanced